There's also this, I think, a similarity between science and specifically the Nalanda tradition of Buddhism that Tibetan Buddhism comes from, with the emphasis on critical thinking and debate. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of critical thinking in your strain of Buddhism and how it's similar or different from scientific criticism and skepticism.
Although it is the Nalanda tradition that emphasized critical thinking, but to be pedantic, I would argue that to respect the original spirit of the Buddha himself, if you are serious about Buddhist practice, you also need to take critical thinking seriously. Because the famous quotation from the Buddha, test what I've said and don't accept them just because you have devotion for me. So in other words, he's saying that in order for Dharma practice to really have an impact, it needs to be internalized. It's only through internalizing the teaching that there can be a real impact. But the internalization process would involve processing whatever teaching you have received. And that processing cannot be done by someone else for you. It has to be done by yourself. Yeah. And so some element of critical thinking, whether we call it critical thinking or critical reflection or contemplation or application of a disciplined mind, whatever language we use, is assumed. Now, of course, Buddhist teachings does allow some individuals may approach the Dharma primarily through devotion. And faith can be a very powerful experience because there you are completely able to let go and trust yourself. So that can take you up to a point. But in the end, for insights into the key truths of reality, impermanence, no self, emptiness, there's simply no way without application of some kind of disciplined thought. And there's just no way, because in order for these insights to be internalized, you have to process it yourself. You have to make them real for you. And that making real has to involve critical thinking. Now, of course, historically, Nalanda tradition is the one that has really taken Buddha's injunction to heart and then fleshed it out, formalized it, and developed methodology of applying it. So if you look at Nagarjuna's fundamental treatise on the middle way, there are a series of arguments. If this were to be the case, there will be these kind of consequences. Given these consequences are unacceptable, therefore the original premise, the assumption must be false. Because in the end, one has to admit that language and thought can never capture the entirety of reality. That is a fact. And also our conceptualization, our habitual thought patterns often underlie, many of our own problems, afflictions, grasping, so on and so forth. And all of that is all true. But because of this, sometimes there is a tendency in the West who are inclined towards Buddhism to even then reject disciplined application of thought, saying that all thoughts are to be rejected. And that is a dangerous path, because if you shut out disciplined application of thought, then what do you have? You have faith. And then you just close your eyes and wait for something to happen. And then that approach, to be honest, is based upon some kind of belief in a miracle. Meditation is like a miracle. You sit down, close your eyes, don't think, and then something will happen. That's not really what Buddha had in mind. And then the Buddha himself has this famous example of the raft. The raft is necessary to cross the river. But once you have crossed it, you don't carry on your back. But without the raft, you can't cross the river. That does not mean getting rid of the raft in the first place, right from the beginning. So I think here the Nalanda tradition, which is powerfully represented in the Tibetan tradition by Je Tsongkhapa's teaching, is to really say that disciplined application of thought is what leads us to what Tsongkhapa calls ascertainment, ngepa. It is through deepening our ascertainment, making it clear, making it more enduring, making it stronger, that we will then be able to counter its opposites, all the distorted perception of reality. And the distorted perceptions of reality can only be removed by directly opposing the perspective they bring. Simply stopping to engage with them is not going to do the trick. So I think the disciplined application of thought and the critical thinking that the Nalanda tradition proposes sits really well with science. Because in the end, what matters most is the evidence. And the evidence is discovered through a process, okay? And then through rigor of an inquiry, You then see all the counterfactuals, counterexamples, and so on and so forth. And then you begin to see the flaws in your thinking. It is only through subjecting your thought and assumptions to critical inquiry that you are able to see the falsity of them. So I think there science and Buddhism really share a lot of similarities, at least on the method level, a certain commitment to rigor, certain commitment to conceptual clarity, and certain commitment to the prioritization of evidence, not the method itself. And when the process of inquiry reveals certain limitations in your original assumption, the willingness to make changes. Now, of course, on the Buddhist side, it may be a little harder to change because the tradition matters. And then especially if it's something that has been said by a revered master, then letting go of that becomes harder. Whereas the scientists have much less loyalty. The tradition matters in terms of history, but in terms of loyalty, scientists generally don't have to worry too much about that. So that's one difference. But then within the history of Buddhism, we also see great masters who are truly original. Nagarjuna's critique of Abhidhamma Buddhism, which was the mainstream during his time. Then you see Tsongkhapa in Tibet, who basically rethought the entire heritage of Indian tradition in Tibet and came up with his own kind of synthetic version. Every now and then you see great masters in the Buddhist tradition that completely taking stock of what the tradition has given up to now, and then how can we bring a fresh perspective. And the fresh perspective in Buddhism really involves constant correlation to the personal practice and experience. That's one big difference between science and Buddhism, because in the end, Buddhist inquiry into the nature of reality is motivated not simply by wanting to know reality, which is what science is, but Buddhist inquiry is motivated by deeper objectives of finding liberation, freedom from suffering, gaining insights as a way to enlightenment, and so forth. Yeah.